All right, thank you guys for joining us for the fourth part of our five-part presentation on the 5W's of dyslexia and everything to do with appropriate intervention and advocacy for our children with dyslexia. So we're down to our last two W's. We've answered why we have a problem. We've answered the what dyslexia is and when to test. And if you want to be able to download all these parts of the presentation, remember you can just go to dyslexiaondemand.com. But now we're going to answer the who. Who do we turn to fix this problem? And we're going to touch on progress monitoring and accommodations. So schools should be a place that service all our kids, regardless of their neurodiversity. And at the end of the day, it's the school's responsibility to provide individualized, appropriate, and effective intervention for these kids. Some areas of neurodiversity fall into an area of accommodations, like Tourette's syndrome or standalone ADHD, or maybe a seizure disorder. But dyslexia is a language processing disorder impacting reading and writing. And what is more fundamental to education than reading and writing? If this doesn't prove the need for quality intervention for our kids with dyslexia, I don't know what does. This is Scarborough's reading rope, and it is a very famous illustration of all the fine threads that need to be woven into to achieve skilled reading. If you have a reading comprehension problem, you have a reading problem. You can't be good at comprehension without mastering all the building blocks to get there. We must have a sound basis in all of these sub-skills to achieve skilled reading and ultimately comprehension. We need curriculum that addresses all these fine-tuned areas and folks who understand how to build these. This is another plug for structured literacy, since it breaks down the building blocks of reading and writing so much more. And if you want to know more about structured literacy, that is in part 1 of this series. OG. It's a common term related to dyslexia remediation. And it's really like just a simple, basic Google search will come up. How do I intervene with a child with dyslexia? Well, Orton-Gillingham. But Orton-Gillingham is an umbrella term. It's a methodology, meaning a multisensory approach to literacy instruction. It is not a specific program name. And there's a lot of variability in what is out there, from a free download off the internet to curriculums that require rigorous standards to implement. It started in the 20s when Orton and Gillingham discovered that the word-blind brain responded to this. They are the OGs of OG. That's what I call them. They didn't discover dyslexia, but they figured out that the dyslexic brain responded to this. But for your purposes, simply specifying OG is just not enough. It's important that we know more about the specific programs and trainings or certifications we're asking for, since most of it technically falls under that OG umbrella. There's also lots of offerings out there that vary in intensity. When it comes to quality long-term work for dyslexia, it needs to be intensive in time and depth. This is the main difference between dyslexia tutoring and dyslexia therapy. A quality dyslexia interventionist is going to work through a slow process of creating new neural pathways in the child's brain to access the written code with automaticity, meaning without conscious effort, thought, or focus. And this is completely achievable using multisensory, high repetition, explicit, and systematic literacy instruction specifically targeted at the needs of the dyslexic brain. And I mentioned orthographic mapping earlier in this presentation, but it's what good readers' brains can do. As you connect the pronunciation and the meaning of the word with its spelling, you create new neural pathways that allow you to remember the words instantly. Once a typically developing reader has done this a few times, the written form never has to be decoded again. And once it's been mapped in the memory, the only thing that can take it away is a brain injury. It can be accessed instantly for things like fluent reading and spelling. But this is what dyslexic brains struggle to achieve, since they aren't pulling from the right part of their brain. but it is the ultimate goal of quality dyslexia intervention. The good news is that they can read and effectively learn to read and effectively overcome dyslexia. We're not going to stop them from being dyslexic, but we can change the primary impact of dyslexia, which is reading and spelling. Overcoming does not mean becoming a master compensator like one principal suggested to me the other day. It means retraining the brain to begin to function like a neurotypical brain. So here's the perfect storm, right? We identify them early because the younger you are, the easier it is to change the brain and how to interpret and how it interprets reading and spelling. It is seamless for a young child to learn a new language, but it's much harder the older you are. Same concept. And you can turn a speedboat around quick, but a tugboat takes much longer. Again, same concept. Older you are, longer it proves it takes. That's why those K-1 screeners are so important. But once we identify, here are some of the consistent buzzwords that dyslexia intervention needs to include: evidence-based, explicit, systematic, multisensory, and high repetition. And ideally, this is delivered by someone who is certified in Orton-Gillingham, preferably on the therapist level. If you have a very specific electrical problem in your house, you're going to call in a master electrician, not a general contractor. It's the same thing. Research shows that it is intensive and it's not a quick fix. I believe personally in 240 minutes for an average per week for an average of 2 years. We're not band-aiding a problem. It is much bigger than that. We're restructuring the neural pathways to provide the dyslexic brain with the ability to access the written code with automaticity, meaning like a neurotypical reading brain. I tell parents that this is like braces for the brain, except that you come out with a life skill and not a cosmetic outcome. And this is done for an average of 2 years. We don't rewire half the house when we call in that master electrician. All facets of structural literacy are very in-depth, and it takes a lot of time to cover. We do not stop after we teach the phonemes and graphemes and very, very basic syllabication patterns. With dyslexia intervention and all reading instruction, really, every component of literacy needs to be incorporated and delivered in a very explicit manner, very intentional and very explicit. There needs to be a deliberate why. It doesn't pick, if the dyslexic brain doesn't pick all this stuff on its own, we need to provide them with rule-based reasoning. And it needs to be multisensory. That's just brain science, right? Brains pick it up that much more effectively when it's done in a multisensory way. Do I remember a recipe better if I read it or if I cook it? It's the same thing. So why not apply that to literacy? Now, if you notice, these are a lot of the same elements that existed in part 1 in my conversation about structured literacy, because this is structured literacy. It's prescriptive, multisensory structured literacy targeted at each child's specific needs profile. So if we implement this type of instruction from the earliest stages, we would actually eliminate many of the kids who get flagged later on. And there's an enormous discrepancy between Orton-Gillingham programs. So I like to break them into topical and intensive, or dyslexia tutoring versus dyslexia therapy. Remember that Orton-Gillingham is simply a blanket term for a multisensory approach to literacy instruction, and it comes in all shapes and sizes. Most schools do not even have OG programming, but when they do, this is where many schools and parents are going wrong. They're choosing topical. When OG is delivered in schools or at home, choosing topical shows why students don't make the progress that we would hope. Of course, some can. I'm not saying that they don't, but it really has so much to do with their dyslexia profile. Moderate and severe dyslexic kids definitely need intensive, but in the public school system, I respect there are limitations to time and money, staffing, etc. So let's go through them. Okay. So in topical, very limited training is needed. There's no explicit guideline on frequency. Again, less intensity. It is not delivered at that high rate of intensity that I mentioned, 240 minutes per week, etc. It is often delivered in a group. It's less effective for severe dyslexia, but it is what is used in school, if at all. In converse, dyslexia therapy is intensive. It requires a high level of training to implement. It's evidence-based, it's research, and we're using those fidelity standards. A lot of times those fidelity standards look like 240 minutes per week, for an average of 2 years. The goal is the creation of neural pathways. Ideally, it's individualized and one-on-one, and we're using data to drive our next decision. It's a quick feedback loop. Oops, sorry. There we go. Okay, so there's so much merit to be placed in the level of the training. This requires a high level of training. That's so important versus in the name of the program. I always say that, and I'll talk about that more in a second. Several evidence-based programs exist out there, and this is why it's so important that we place the merit in the level of training of the ship captain versus the name of the program. These are all buzzwords of what evidence-based programs need to be, since this is what research shows is effective to the dyslexic brain for creation of long-term results versus just band-aiding a problem. And we need someone highly trained that's going to understand how to make those individualized adjustments to the specific dyslexia profile needs of the kid, including but not limited to pacing, repetition rate, the depth of exposure, and then, of course, layering more for comorbid needs. I can choose some kind of evidence-based curriculum, but that doesn't mean that at its delivery, at the way that it is written in the programming, it's going to be enough. So that means that I may need to layer on additional supplement from other curriculum. So schools need individualized certified in the process of OG who implement evidence-based instruction. And remember, most school level supports are not. Often they're allowing very watered down equivalents of someone highly qualified. So it's like sending a teacher to a 5-day training to be the campus SLP or speech and language pathologist, and her doing the job over someone who is certified as an SLP. But when it comes to dyslexia, the respect just doesn't exist, and they often think that they can do the equivalent of this, but then wonder why the kids get stuck in the spin cycle loop of intervention. So also, there are huge differences in what certified mean. Certified is not the same across programming. I don't know any other chart like this out there, so it's very important information. And just PS, I compiled this from Google searches and, of course, my professional resources. So you can technically be certified at the therapist, practitioner, and classroom level. So don't feel assured that when you hear someone is OG certified or dyslexia certified, that you have what you need. You need to dig more to find out where they fall in that spectrum. And this chart is a combination of therapist, practitioner, and some classroom level. Even though there are definite higher levels, please note, I am so excited about anyone who dedicates to any level of certification. So this is not a criticism, but you guys need to know the difference. A quality dyslexia interventionist is an amazing ship captain. He or she understands the dyslexic brain and how to read their dials, and they're prescriptive to plotting the course of the journey using data. In my professional opinion, this is a certified academic language therapist. They hold a master's degree plus 2 additional years of training in the dyslexic brain and their therapeutic approach, and in structured literacy. It is not a proprietary designation like in Wilson, but more of a specialty certification in language therapy and thorough dyslexia knowledge. They have to, after they study for 2 additional years, pass their master's, they have to pass a national board certification exam proving this, and then they're regulated by a third-party professional organization called the Academic Language Therapy Association. They do not all do one program because they are not certified in their knowledge of a program. They are certified in their knowledge of dyslexia and all that it encompasses. But many names that they are implementing are what are considered to be quote unquote therapeutic grade or level dyslexia programming that often cannot be purchased off the shelf unless they've proven their credentialing. So some of the names of these are Take Flight, basic language skills. That's a very popular, both of those are very popular in my area of the country. Sounds and syllables is one that is a lot more kind of East Coast. And then there's alphabetic phonics, just to name a couple. These individuals also have to receive continuing ed hours every single year. But from here on, it gets less intensive. Now, like I mentioned, Wilson level 2, lots of study, but at the end of the day, they are certified in the Wilson program. Same thing with Wilson level 1. Personally, I feel like the next best qualified individual after a CALT is going to be someone who is certified as an OG therapist through AOGA. They have almost as much as experience, expectation as a CALT, but they I lost my train of thought. Oh, they don't have a master's degree, excuse me. And when everything is just going to decrease in complexity. But recognize a lot of these guys, you have to understand if they are certified therapist, practitioner, or classroom level, because a lot of these, even certified OG right here, IMSC, Siri, even a CALP, that's considered to be classroom level, although that's something else that's monitored under the Academic Language Therapy Association. So point being, there's a lot of difference out there. And there's nothing wrong with any of this. I'm just trying to show that the level of training and certification does matter. And a great one to bring up is Barton, right? That is very commonly used, especially on the East Coast, especially with homeschool parents. And that's what it was designed for. It was to be an accessible solution for parents. And there's merit to this program, but in effect, it only takes 8 hours to become certified in it. So there isn't nearly the intensity or knowledge to apply. And please recognize, before anybody calls me out, I am aware that Susan Barton has trained a handful of individuals, but that percentage is very small in comparison with the majority out there. But when this layer of programming doesn't work, the person implement without that training, right? They can't understand why, or they can't troubleshoot. That's why it matters if they're trained in a program or a skill or the level of intensity with which their programming was. So it's important that those representing kids in a school can drill down to the level of training of the individual providing intervention to the student at the school. What qualifies them to be the expert on campus? Know that those who are certified and who can be considered to be dyslexia experts on the campus, they're very few and far between. They're generally non-existent on that school campus. And I do appreciate that schools are making an effort, but you need to be able to recognize those names and what their level of certification in these programs that they have. OGA, IMSE, Wilson, Siri, DTI, they all have classroom level trainings, and these are less intensive, but they're still technically quote unquote certified. So does that classroom level expert certify them as being the dyslexia expert for the campus, or does that classroom level certification qualify them enough to be the dyslexia expert for the campus? And a saying that I stole from a friend of mine, a powerhouse advocate in Texas, is that there isn't one pill that cures every sickness. So you want someone who is expert enough in dyslexia to be able to pick up any evidence-based curriculum and apply their knowledge of how to do therapy and individualization to each student to make it prescriptive to the student. What is much more common out there is someone whose knowledge doesn't reach further than how to turn the next page in the lesson manual. But what happens if it isn't effective for that student? What then? When you have the knowledge, you can make adaptations to the curriculum to make it effective for every student. And slow and steady wins the race. Be wary of anything that cures dyslexia too quickly or too intensely. Any quality, long-term effective programming occurs over an average of 2 years at a really high repetition rate. When you consider the amount of layering that we need to cover that encompasses all of structured literacy, it takes a really long time. And the amount of repetitions is different for each child. A child's brain can only process so much at once. So if you overload it, say work for 5 hours straight, the brain isn't going to be able to manage it and retain it. And a quick element to focus on, if reading is breathing in, writing is breathing out. It 100% should be an integral piece of any therapeutic level instruction, since it means as much to the brain as reading learning. If you can spell it, you can read it. In terms of development, it's the last stop on the language continuum. So expect reading standard scores to increase first, and then with time and repetition, the spelling and written expression scores will follow. Repetitions are so huge and they vary depending on the dyslexia profile and cognitive profile of the kiddo. The more severe, the more compromised the processing speed and working memory of the child, the more repetitions they're going to need. And if they have ADHD, all of these things have to be taken into account. And as a whole, children with dyslexia can need as many as 20 times the exposures to a concept as their neurotypical peers. In therapy, you should never, or in any kind of intervention, you should never introduce a concept and then drop it. That is a lot of what happens at school. It needs to continually be rewoven into presentation for the brain to have enough exposures to be able to successfully ingrain it. Also, any program can just teach phonics. We need the structure of the English language also. So focusing on instruction of the 44 phonemes, the 96 phoneme grapheme correspondence rules, we must continue on to affixes and roots in order for kids to start to really develop and decipher vocabulary on its own. So anytime districts want to shortchange and they want to stop that intervention after we've gone through all the phonemes and the grapheme correspondence rules, I say wrong. We have to move on to those more in-depth affixes and roots. They're so important to decipher vocab. All right, so in the next few slides, I've incorporated some pieces of a therapeutic session so that you can see what true dyslexia therapy looks like. These were done by a CALT using Take Flight, which is an evidence-based therapeutic program created by the Texas Scottish Rite Hospital for Children. The only individuals who have access to this curriculum are those who have achieved certification as a CALT or who are in training. Watch for some huge differences in what therapy looks like in comparison to what typical school intervention looks like. This is only one part of a lesson. I'm going to take you through a couple parts. Here, the student is Discovery Learning Diagraph SH.
Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and we're going to review the vowel chart before we code and read these words. So let's look at the very first one, a vowel. A breathe. Good job. A vowel in an open accented syllable is long, code with a make sound. Good job. And over here, two adjacent vowels in the same syllable may form digraph. Good job, very good. So we know that whenever we see digraph SH, we're going to underline digraph SH. So let's do these together. So we're going to what? Underline digraph SH. Code U with a breathe. underline digraph SH, code O with a breathe, code C with a K back, code A with a breathe, and underline digraph SH. So now let's read these three words. Hot, cat. Great job. So again, whenever we see digraph SH, digraph SH will be read. There.
All right, here's a piece of phonemic awareness work in a take flight lesson where the student must listen for where the sound changes in the word and identify the change. These mouth pictures each represent the shape of your mouth and placement of your tongue when making each one of these phonemes or sounds, and was adapted from the Linda Mubel Lips program. With a deeper connection to the individual grapheme than just a character.
So now let's see, what are the steps for this part? Let's start. Let's see. Show me the word shut. Echo. Shut. Unblend. For that word. And if this is the word shut, show me cut. Echo. Cut. Let's unblend. Oops. This is the word cut. This is bed. Echo. Unblend.
All right, here's, oops, sorry. Okay, this is a component focused on rapid automatized retrieval.
Okay, so let's see. Looking at this page, what do you notice that is alike on the top section of the page? And how are we going to read digraph SH? There we go. So let's echo row number 1. Shut. Shed. Ship. Sham. Now you read row number 2.
Shop, ship, shut, shed.
Great job, very good. And now in the middle section, what do you notice alike there?
CH.
All of these words, very good. They have digraph CH. And how do we read digraph CH? Chin,
Chin,
chop, chip, chat, chum.
chum,
Now you do number 2.
chop, chad, chin, chum, chip.
All right, and I'm not going to make you sit through the entire page of that, but that's an example of where we're going to adjust and make them do more repetitions if needed. That's just one example of a place that we can make adaptations. All right, so this is a component of a lesson that's focused in on spelling.
Okay, so let's see. What are the steps for spelling? Today, remember that which ones would you pull for that word?
I would pull
Very good. That we have the right mouth pictures. I want to, with your finger, touch and spell the word mesh. So now we're going to think not about the sounds, but about the letters. So how would you spell that word? We're going to touch and spell. So one more time. How would we spell that?
Okay. Ooh. So hopefully you remember earlier the second part of this presentation, this slide. But before, it was a slide of a neurotypical reading brain and a dyslexic brain showing the areas of stimulation. This one's similar, but now both are of the dyslexic brain. One prior to intensive evidence-based intervention, and then after intensive evidence-based intervention. Now, the dyslexic brain on the right looks like the neurotypical reading brain. And if you want to see actual MRI evidence, they're all over Google. It proves that the neural pathways can be created so that the dyslexic brain can access the written code. But this only happens after an average of 2 years of therapy with someone highly trained. We're literally stripping away the compensation tactics used by the dyslexic brain and retraining it by rebuilding the foundation bottom up, creating neural pathways, leaving the brain with the ability to process literacy with automaticity. All right, data is an extremely important piece of any therapeutic level environment. If not, how do we know what's working, sticking, etc.? Continual data gathering and regular progress monitoring is hugely important. Ideally, you want this data to come from both formal and informal level data. And you need to design an environment that has a quick feedback loop so that we don't move too far ahead before reflecting if we need to calibrate our therapeutic tweaks for the student's needs. Here are some of the areas that need to be regularly monitored to continually reflect on growth for each specific child. In schools, I find that what they're often assessing using tools, they're assessing using tools that don't measure what they're actually instructing on. And this is a big problem in my opinion. There needs to be alignment. So for kids with dyslexia, we need to make sure that we're instructing and assessing in these areas. It also means that the person who is providing that high quality intervention needs to be part of that special ed team so that we're writing goals, etc., that are in line with what they're learning. I think it's important to use both formal and informal data in progress monitoring. Here are some suggested batteries for formal norm reference progress monitoring. If we're creating neural pathways, you'll see this occur through growth in standard score. This data is going to show a much more drilled down level of data that isn't reflected in those FIEs, etc. And it paces with typical scope and sequence of therapeutic delivery. If that last slide looked at formal progress monitoring battery, this focuses on informal progress monitoring tools. There are so many. So to assess what your school is using, check out the Center of Intensive Intervention to see an in-depth review of its efficacy. This is an awesome site for reviewing not only progress monitoring tools, but also effective curriculum. Here's an example of, or some examples actually, of redacted formal progress monitoring. Notice the level of detail we get to see as we move through the examples, both overall and detail as it overlays onto therapeutic delivery. This is at a student's baseline evaluation through to exit. Growth rates are always different for every child based on their cognitive profile and severity of dyslexia, or I would try to give you a general average standard score growth. Okay, so this is the same student as before. So you see at the top and in the back slide, the last slide, we're looking at kind of more of a snapshot of where they are in some of these skills, subset skills, right? And remember, we're looking at composite along with subtest skills. And then we're going to drill into things that, like, you know, how they're evolving as it goes through and over skills related to the scope and sequence of structured literacy. Here's a second student with baseline through to exit, and it's green in this one because we changed how we did presented, and every time a child had increased, it's in green. So even though a child can go through intensive dyslexia therapy and effectively overcome dyslexia, it doesn't mean that we don't need to have accommodations in place for them. For your purposes, it's important that we fight for both quality intervention and appropriate accommodations tailored to fit the needs of the child. Accommodations are like providing a ramp for kids with dyslexia. With therapy, we can often bring some kids into the average range in all of those subtest scores and composite scores. But but not always completely, depending on the starting point, right? What did the baseline tell us as to where that starting point range was? And that's usually a lot of times based on the level of severity of their dyslexia, if we can bring them into the average range. Some weaknesses will likely always exist. We can't necessarily close the gap 100%. So this is why they're going to need accommodations written into their IEPs. Just like someone who's deaf, we can't visibly see their disability. But it doesn't mean that it's not there. And we don't get to or necessarily want to wear sounds around our neck explaining our neurodiversity. So I hear this from parents all the time. Aren't these accommodations going to create a crutch for our kids? And the answer is no. They aren't. They are simply leveling the playing field and allowing them to demonstrate what they know in a way that doesn't rely on decoding and encoding. So accommodations vary so much by age and need. I literally could do an entire presentation on accommodations, but here are my tips for approaching them. Do not just accept that blanket list that you always see added to the IEP just because they have dyslexia. This is an area that we really need to control and personalize in an IEP and continually adjust them. Accommodations for a first grader are vastly different than that for a fourth grader, a high schooler, etc., because their needs are different and the rigor of the academics they're presented with are different. And so this is why we need to review them annually and should craft and individualize them. We can freestyle in accommodations a whole lot. Maybe not for state tests, but for everyday delivery, we can. So an example for my son is that he, on spelling tests, he does not have to spell the sight words. So he does have to apply the phonetic concept that they're teaching. But when it comes to that other component of the way that they do their spelling test was correctly spelling sight words, he doesn't have to get graded on that, right? Or if they have the ability to express their knowledge verbally on a test instead of a multiple choice answer or a short answer, for example. And the other thing that I suggest is don't have a laundry list of accommodations like 20, because what's going to happen is no one's going to use any of them. The kid doesn't remember that that's accessible to them, and the teacher doesn't remember the vast list of accommodations that kid has, especially because there are probably other kids in the class with vast lists of accommodations. So what happens is nothing happens. So no matter what you choose to craft, be aware that accommodations should and can exist and cover all of these areas: presentation level accommodations, response accommodations, setting, timing, organizational accommodations, and then of course, assistive technology. So as we're talking about assistive technology, I always love this one. Audiobooks are needed for our kids, and they really should always be on that accommodations list. So speaking of assistive technology, I'm going to plug a free webinar that we're putting on, Dyslexia On Demand is putting on. So I heard this guy speak at a different conference, and I promise you I've been to 100 different presentations on assistive technology, and by far this guy blew me away. He is the owner of an award-winning company. He's the CEO of it. He was the founder of Stand Up for LD. And what drives this home is that his presentation home is that he is speaking from first perspective, because he is someone who has severe dyslexia, who has to use all of these pieces of assistive technology personally on a day-to-day level, right? So I think it's just so much more impactful because it is what he uses to foster his own success. Okay, so one last accommodation to suggest is to make sure that we're taking into account the amount of time that it takes our children with dyslexia to complete the same task as someone neurotypical. So, an example I use with my son in 6th grade, he gets a math worksheet and it has, 30 items on it. But we don't need to prove his knowledge in 30, right? He can prove it in 10, for example. So make sure that you're always taking these kind of things into account. All right, so that is my last slide in the 4th part of the 5-part series of the 5W's of dyslexia. If you would like to see the other parts or want to know where to find the 5th part that I'm going to be doing next, that is, where are we going? The impacts of not fixing this widespread problem. You can go to Dyslexia On Demand to download it. So thank you so much, guys. And I look forward to seeing you at the last part of our 5-part series.